All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the FI AI Pilot webinar, Conscious Consumption in a Post-COVID-19 Normal ASEAN. This is the second webinar of a three-part series, so please look out for our third and final webinar on India in the next few weeks. My name is May, and I'm from Food Industry Asia. So before we begin, I'd like to share with you the format of today's session. It will be 30 minutes of presentation by our speaker, followed up by 20 minutes of Q&A. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them in the chat box, which is at the right side of your screen, and we will address it during the Q&A segment. Also, a note that all attendees will be muted for the entire session, and the webinar will be recorded. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker for the day, Salome, who is the Head of Innovation and Insights at AI Palette. Salome, please.
Thanks for that introduction, May, and thank you to everybody joining us today. What we've seen is that countries in ASEAN are in different stages of opening up and recovery post the COVID-19 pandemic. On one hand, you have Thailand, where the state of emergency has been extended. On the other hand, Indonesia and Philippines are taking a more localized approach to the lockdown, especially in this second wave of the pandemic. On the other hand, Singapore and Malaysia are undergoing a phased relaxation of the lockdown measures as we speak. So for this webinar today, what we've done is that we, in collaboration with Food Industry Asia, have used artificial intelligence and machine learning to see which patterns and behaviors which have risen in the context of COVID-19 have actually stuck and had a lasting impact. We'll also see how different stakeholders in the food and beverage space are responding to this new normal. Overall, what we see is that consumers are definitely becoming more conscious and deliberate when it comes to making decisions about food, and which is what brings us to the second part of the conscious consumption web series, where we will be looking at the ASEAN region. I'll start by telling you a little bit about AI Palette and the technology that we've built. Then I'll walk you through the methodology that we've used to put together and build this analysis. Then we'll look at the drivers and motivations and see how those have evolved as the pandemic has unfolded. We'll also look at what impact those drivers are having on different product categories. And finally, identify some patterns and opportunities that stakeholders in the food and beverage space can tap into. As May mentioned, I'm Salome. I'm the Head of Innovation and Insights at AI Palette. I come with a background in brand management, having worked in different markets across Asia and the US as well. For those of you joining us for the first time, let me start by telling you a little bit about AI Palette. So we are a Singapore-based startup which is backed by the government of Singapore. We essentially use artificial intelligence to work with consumer goods companies and other companies in the food and beverage space to help them identify and predict trends in real time. We've built a trend spotting platform to do this. Typically, we give our clients access to this platform, but today, for ease of sharing, we've built this report. Next, let me walk you through what makes our approach at AI Palette unique. Firstly, we start by focusing on data which is specific to food and beverages. The reason that is really key is because the context in which consumers use language when it comes to food tends to be quite unique. Let me give you an example of the word hot. Hot, when used in the context of food, typically means something which is spicy and rich in chili and not referring to the temperature. So, which is why we've trained our patented algorithm on food and beverage related data. Then, for each market that we've looked at what are the most popular data sources in that market to give us insight into what the local consumer is saying. And lastly, our algorithm is language agnostic. What that means is that we have trained it to understand multiple non-English languages. For today's analysis, we'll be using the algorithm's ability to understand languages like Thai, Tagalog, and Bahasa and Malay. So for this webinar, overall, we've looked at a total of 590 million consumer data points over the time period of January 2019 to August 2020. This time period has been broken down into three portions. The 2019 data helps us establish a baseline. And then when we look at the 2020 data, we've split it first looking at January to April to see how the data was in the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we've looked at data from May to August to give us some insight into the second wave. We've looked at the most popular public data sources, that's social media platforms like Instagram and Twitter, and data from the Google search engine, which is the most popular in this part of the world. We've also looked at retail products from different local e-commerce websites like Redmart, Tops, Tesco Lotus, Click and Domarat, to give you a few examples. Next, let's come to the let's look at how the drivers and motivations have evolved as the COVID-19 pandemic has hit this region. So here what we see is that when we looked at the first 3 months of the year, what we saw was that there was a lot of panic buying. So in addition to drivers like health, there were other key drivers like distribution and packaging, which were also really influencing decisions. But there has been a shift in that where consumers are now being more intentional about the choices that they're making. What that essentially translates to is that, of course, health and taste are still very key drivers. In fact, in most countries in ASEAN, we actually see consumers are giving more importance to taste as a driver, even above health. We see that in markets like Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand in particular. Singapore is the only country in the ASEAN region where health is actually a more important driver. Next, what we see is that consumers are looking for food which is easy to prepare. Ease of preparation is a key driver, which is reflected here in this yellow portion. And essentially, that translates to the convenience that consumers are seeking. On the other hand, in markets, particularly like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, we see consumers being more price conscious. Price is this purple bar right here. At the same time, in Singapore and Philippines, the safety and quality of food is absolutely key, as shown by this orange section here. And lastly, we see that there is a need for food which is natural and organic in markets across Asia. And in Singapore in particular, consumers are experimenting much more where they are looking for food which is new and innovative. This was a broad overview of the drivers in the ASEAN region. Let's now double click to dig deeper into how each of these drivers is unfolding. First, looking at the important driver of health. So overall, as the graph here shows, health as a broad driver definitely saw a peak in the month of March and April during the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. But overall, what we have seen is that the lockdown in particular has meant that for a lot of us, the pace of our lifestyle has definitely slowed down. So now consumers are really actively looking for products which will help them deal with the aftermath of this sedentary lifestyle that the lockdown has brought with it. That is reflected in an increase in consumer interest for products which help in dieting, fitness, and weight watching. So overall, we definitely see that consumers are looking for products which will help them deal with the aftermath of this sedentary lifestyle. Overall, health was reflected in 101 million consumer data points. Let me take a few examples from those millions of data points that we've analyzed to see what kind of products are being launched to drive this. So when we dig deeper into the broader umbrella of health, what we see is that there are many products which are being launched, which are tapping into this increased demand for not only building immunity, but also improving gut health. We've taken a few interesting examples from the data here. In Singapore, for instance, a company called Avida Health has launched chocolate covered beta glucan balls. These are essentially beta glucans derived from fungi, and these products are in particular targeting children of the age group from 4 to 12. And these functional products are aimed at helping children boost their immunity, particularly as schools have started opening up in the past few months. Then we also have different brands. For instance, we've taken the example of Seavit from Thailand, where they have launched a variety of products which are catering to this increased demand for immunity and vitamin C by launching jelly drinks to offer consumers who are seeking vitamin C a new experience. On the other hand, there are also brands like Rebisco, for instance, from Philippines, which are catering to this overarching demand for gut health with different products. For instance, the example we've taken here is that of crackers which contain inulin fibers to help in increased absorption of nutrients. So these are just some examples which are tapping into the broader overarching demand for health. Next, digging into the driver of taste. So here what we've really seen is that based on 122 million data points, taste is really a very important driver. And different brands are catering to this surge in demand for local authentic flavors. The reason local flavors are really important is because consumers are seeking comfort in their food. So they're really going back to flavors which they are familiar with. Some examples here, for instance, from Indonesia, there is a brand called Heavenly Blush, which has launched a Greek yogurt which also incorporates black glutinous rice, which is a traditional food in Indonesia. On the other hand, another example from Indonesia is that of Rai Cheese Factory, which has launched a mala chicken product. International brands like Subway are also catering to this increased demand for local, authentic flavors, and they've launched a variety of spicy sandwiches in Malaysia. Few examples like hot pepper chicken sandwich or spicy mayo chicken sandwiches. So these are just some examples in which brands are customizing their product offerings to cater to this increased demand for local and authentic flavors. The next driver that we want to highlight today is that of convenience and ease of preparation. So overall, what we've seen is that brands are really tweaking their product offering to cater to this increased demand for ease of preparation. I'll take a few examples from different markets in ASEAN to drive home this point. When we looked at the very popular category of milk tea, what we saw was that brands like Liho in Singapore and Tea Live in Malaysia have launched bubble tea kits. The underlying insight here is that they want to help consumers recreate their favorite recipes and favorite milk tea recipes in the comfort of their own homes. We also have this DIY mindset being reflected in the alcoholic beverages category as well, where from if you look at different bars in Singapore, we've taken the example of Harry's here, where they're launching cocktail and mocktail pouches to help consumers recreate their favorite cocktails at home. These were particularly popular when bars in Singapore, for instance, were shut down during the pandemic. This broader trend of DIY, we also see it unfolding in the meal kit space as well. This is just one example of Taco Bell, for instance, which has launched a DIY meal kit in Thailand, which is, in a way, it is Taco Bell's way of customizing and tweaking their product offering to make it easier for consumers to eat these products at home. So we definitely see more and more brands launching meal kits as well. Next, let me pick up a driver which is unique to Singapore. So in Singapore, what we see is that consumers are really experimenting a lot with new and innovative flavors. When we looked at the consumer conversations here, what we saw was that they're really using these flavors, these new and different products to help break the monotony that the lockdown has brought about. Some examples here are from Liho Tea. Liho Tea, for instance, has really jumped on the Dalgona trend, which became very popular during the COVID-19 lockdown, where they've launched an entire series which combines Dalgona coffee with tea. You also have other brands like Boba Tea, for instance, which has launched bubble tea, which is topped with caramel popcorn and even butterscotch milk tea. So these products are really tapping into the underlying demand for indulgence, but indulgence in a small way, especially during the uncertainty that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought about with it. The next driver that we want to highlight today is this increasing need for organic and natural products. So the overarching theme of organic and natural can manifest itself in different ways across categories. In some categories, it has meant the launch of products which are chemical free. On the other hand, in the snack space, for instance, there are a lot of products which have launched which are multigrain and whole grain. One example here from Thailand is this better vegan milkshake, essentially which taps into the underlying need for not only plant protein, but also plant protein which the product is positioned as being a healthy alternative to dairy. Some other examples which tap into the overarching demand for natural products are organic coffee. So this particular product that we've picked up from Philippines is a healthy organic coffee which taps into the need for consumers to detox, cleanse their systems, and really it targets consumers who are seeking natural ways to boost immunity and to heal their systems. So these are just some examples of natural products which offer very holistic health benefits that we've seen being launched in ASEAN. Next, I also want to highlight the driver of food safety. So what we have seen, particularly in Singapore and Philippines, that food safety and food quality was saw a significant surge in consumer interest, particularly in the months of April and May. While that has started coming down, as you can see, as this graph here shows, in Singapore, it's still showing a significant increase in consumer interest. So that makes Singapore and Philippines and the drivers in these two countries unique, which is why we wanted to highlight this today. With that, we've covered the drivers that are influencing consumer decisions. Let's next look at how these are affecting different product categories in the food and beverage space. So, firstly, what we see is that there is a very heavy reliance on natural remedies. This is something that we saw in our first webinar series with FIA as well, and that increased demand for natural remedies continues. But of course, there are local nuances. For instance, in Singapore, we see a significant increase in consumer interest for ginger. In Malaysia, there has been a significant increase in moringa, showing an increase of 102% if you look at the data from Jan to August of 2020. On the other hand, Philippines, there has been an increase in consumer interest for ingredients like kamote, which is a sweet potato, which is known to be very rich in vitamins. There are some unique ingredients also like virgin coconut oil, particularly in Malaysia and Philippines, which have shown an increase in consumer interest, particularly as consumers associate it with immunity. Next, looking at Indonesia and Thailand. So in our first analysis, we had shown a significant increase in consumer interest when it comes to traditional herbal drinks like jamu in Indonesia. So what we see now is that that increase in consumer interest is still very strong, which shows up in increase in popularity in ingredients like curcuma, red ginger, and cinnamon. In Thailand, there is a little bit of a reliance on artificial ways to boost immunity, particularly through multivitamins, selenium, and whey powder. Next, digging into the broader subject of protein. So, there was a question whether consumers are rethinking and re-evaluating their protein choices, and that's what we really want to dig into. So here what we see is that as consumers are cooking more and more at home, the demand for animal protein sources like chicken and beef has returned to normal. On the other hand, animal protein sources like seafood are still showing a decline in consumer conversations, particularly driven by the fact that the supply chains for seafood have not fully recovered. On the other hand, when we look at plant-based protein, we see that brands like Omnipork, Beyond Meat have shown an increase in consumer interest, and that is primarily driven by new products which are launching in the QSR space, which incorporate these brands. As we go further along in the presentation, we'll pick out a few examples to walk you through. Next, looking at Indonesia and Thailand. Again, here what we see is that protein sources like chicken and beef have returned to normal as consumers are cooking more at home. But seafood is still showing a decline, which is also connected to the wet markets and the wholesale seafood markets also being shut for most of the pandemic. On the other hand, plant-based is showing an increase in consumer interest in Indonesia and Thailand as well, which is also driven by the QSR launches, which I mentioned, which we'll dig deeper further along in the presentation. Next, looking at the QSR space and seeing how beverages and fast food has evolved. So here what we see is that particularly in Singapore and Malaysia, as hotels and restaurants started opening up and dining out started becoming more popular again. We see that there has been an increase in consumer interest in these product categories. And when we looked at fast food, what we see in fast food categories like pizzas and burgers, that the QSR chains in these categories are essentially currently working on tweaking their product offering and driving home delivery. But overall, some of these product categories are still in the red if you compare it to the 2019 numbers. Next, when we look at Thailand and Indonesia to see how fast food is evolving there, in Thailand, there has been an increase in consumer interest, which can very clearly be connected to hotels, restaurants opening up. So there has been an increase in consumer interest in fast food and QSR beverages overall. Lastly, I'll highlight the two other product categories. So we also see a very strong demand for fresh food like fruits and vegetables in different markets in ASEAN. And also shelf stable staples, particularly like rice and noodles, while they did show a significant spike in the panic buying and stockpiling days, and that spike has returned to normal, we still see an increase in consumer interest in these shelf stable staples. The next category that I want to highlight is that of snacks and dairy. So overall, the the theme that we saw of snackification of meals still continues to be strong, and that has shown an increase in consumer interest for snacks of different kinds like chips, cakes, etc. And there has also been an increase in consumer interest for dairy products like milk and yogurt. With that, I want to next go into what are some of the broader opportunities which have evolved in this new normal and how different stakeholders in the food and beverage space are tapping into these. So let me first dig into a trend which is currently very popular, that of plant-based protein and plant-based products overall. So here what we see is that a lot of different QSR chains have launched many products which are tapping into this theme for plant-based products. Starbucks, for instance, has launched products in partnership with Impossible Foods, Beyond Meat, and Oatly, for example. And they're also customizing their product offerings to cater to the local authentic flavors. To take an example from Singapore, the picture here shows the rendang pie, which Starbucks has launched here. Taking another example from a local chain, Bread Talk has also launched a plant-based meat bun, which incorporates the Impossible Foods burger, and they are also catering to local flavors. So it's, for instance, this one is incorporates black pepper sauce, and it is wrapped in a charcoal bun. To take a few other examples from the plant-based theme overall, we also see in the retail space there are many different international and local players which are launching products. The example we've taken here is that of Snap Pea, which is a local Malaysian company which has launched pea milk to tap into this broader theme of plant-based protein and products. The challenge uh, for the plant-based trend is now going to be to sustain this consumer interest. So right now it is targeting users who are looking for something new and different, novelty seekers, if you will. So the challenge is going to be, how do you get consumers to regularly purchase these products? Next, going into another pattern which is emerging, this increase in consumer interest when it comes to products which tap into gut health and probiotics. So, here, what we're really seeing is that consumers, particularly in Singapore and Thailand, are really focusing on probiotics. And what really drives that is that probiotics are known to improve gut health. They're also known to increase the absorption of nutrients, and overall, this increased absorption of nutrients helps build the immune system. So, as the numbers here show, there has been a significant increase in consumer interest when it comes to probiotics and yogurt drinks in Singapore. And the graph here also shows a spike in consumer conversations related to gut health. Similarly, in Thailand as well, we've seen a significant increase in consumer interest, particularly for yogurt drinks. And this graph here shows that there was a sudden spike in gut health, particularly when the pandemic was at its most severe in the months of March and April. Some products are already tapping into this broader theme of increased interest in gut health. Some examples here. One example from Singapore, for instance, is that of Asmara, which is a Singapore based beverage brand which also has vitamin supplements, where they've launched a vitamin supplement which incorporates para probiotics, which is tapping into the need for both boosting immunity and improving gut health. On the other hand, we also have in Thailand, the Thailand FDA, for instance, recently approved the use of chicory roots to help improve digestive health. So we expect this overall demand for improving gut health to only increase with time. With that, let me come to the key takeaways. We've walked you through a lot of data today, so I want to end with some key takeaways. Firstly, the point that we want to highlight is that health and taste are still absolutely very key when it comes to consumer decisions in the food and beverage space. And actually, for most markets in ASEAN, there is a preference for taste even over health. Overall, consumers are really seeking the products which are easy and quick to prepare. So convenience has sort of taken a new form in this new normal in COVID-19. Next, what we see is that particularly in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand, consumers are very price conscious. On the other hand, food safety is important for consumers in Singapore and Philippines. Then, as the examples today showed, that there is an increase in consumer interest when it comes to food which is natural and organic, and there are different products which are being launched on e-commerce to tap into this trend. And lastly, particularly in Singapore, consumers are really looking for products that are new and innovative, and they want to experiment with their food choices. With that, I'll end with this parting thought. So we've come to the tail end of 2020, and as the data today showed, COVID-19 definitely has had a lasting impact on consumer behavior and preferences. And we definitely see more and more consumers making informed decisions when it comes to food. We've also seen a few examples of how brands and even restaurants are modifying their product offering to cater to this new normal. In the rest of the series, we'll be next looking at India to see how these trends unfold in the Indian market. So please do feel free to reach out if you are interested in understanding how to use artificial intelligence to spot trends in your market. The study today is done at a cross category level, but our technology does have the ability to dig deeper into the category of your choice as well. With that, thank you for so much for joining us today and for listening to our analysis and our presentation. And may we can open up the floor to questions.